we're looking at ourselves to figure out the best way to reform the various police departments around the country. And let me say this, I think when you look at the consent decree in Baltimore City, I think we can be very proud of the fact that this decree, when it was drafted, was done very carefully. And when you look at it now, it in fact covers just about every reform that the various legislatures and advocates are talking about around the country. Outside of the things that have to be dealt with legislatively, this consent decree is really a roadmap for how you reform a police department. Now, whether or not the police department actually reformed itself, we have to see how that plays out over time. But at least in terms of the blueprint, I think from the monitoring team's perspective, we have a very, very good document to work from. And I think that the progress that we're seeing so far suggests that the reforms that were put in that decree were quite well done. So let me spend a few minutes just doing a brief overview, and then I'm going to turn it over to Chuck and to Seth to kind of put a little meat on the bones. There are a couple of things that we look at from the 50,000 foot level in terms of whether this department is making progress. And the first thing we look at is leadership. Anybody who's been paying attention to the police department since 2017, you've recognized that there has been a revolving door of police commissioners. When the consent decree came into being, and of course, when the monitoring team was selected, which was October of 2017, and when we actually began our work, which was in February of 2018, we started with Commissioner Davis. He lasted a month or so. He was relieved of his duties. We then had Commissioner D'Souza. He lasted a few months. We then ended up with Commissioner Tuggle, interim Commissioner Tuggle. He did about as good a job as he could do, but he was an interim commissioner. And of course, when you have that I in front of your name, it's very difficult to get the rank and file to follow your lead. And so again, he did as good a job as he could do, but obviously there was a leadership issue. So come 2019, Baltimore was very, very lucky, very fortunate in the sense that then City Solicitor Andre Davis was able to convince Michael Harrison to come to Baltimore. And I think having gotten someone of his stature, someone who had his experience, from the monitoring team's perspective, we are obviously seeing a person who has taken command of this department. He's provided the stability that this department needs, and he's beginning to change the culture. And so he not only talks the talk, but he walks the walk. So he's, I think, the right man for the right time for this department. He's also brought with him an incredibly gifted team. His executive team is, I would put up against any team in the country. And so when you have a good leader who surrounded himself with a good executive team, I think from the monitoring team's perspective, we have a very, very good leadership team in place. And so we have someone who's able to captain this ship and is to at least steer it in the right direction. The other big thing that I'm looking at, again, from the 50,000 foot level, is the fact that we spent a good year and a half helping this department, along with the Department of Justice, revise and revamp its policies. And we have I think the department has some really, really good policies. Most people that are experts in this field would let you know these are some of the best policies in the country. But the policies mean very little unless you have good training. And so one of the things that I look at, and of course, Chuck will talk about this in more detail, but we see as a bright spot, as a really, really good bright spot, is the fact that the training has gotten so much better. It's adult-based model. It's what we call scenario-based training. So instead of the old-time lecture-based type of model, you now have a situation where there's a lot of interaction between the students and the professors, for lack of a better term. And so we're getting really good results, and we're getting high marks based on this new training. And so I think that is an incredibly bright spot. And you couple that with the fact that the department now has its training center. It moved from that dingy dungeon on Park Heights Avenue, and it's now located in the University of Baltimore. It's a really, really first-class facility. So in terms of training, in the leadership, I think that those are two really, really big bright spots. Technology is a work in progress. We think that, well, we know since Commissioner Harrison came on board, that area has been jump-started. Lots of things are going on. Lots of good people have been hired, but we are at least a year to a year and a half away from having a technology system in place that is really needed for a bunch of things. But from the monitoring team's perspective, we clearly need it in order to get the data we need to do the assessments that we will have to consider as we go through this process and determine whether the department is in compliance. But the department needs the technology too. I mean, they need it for efficiency. Instead of having police officers write out tickets and write out reports, all this stuff needs to be put on a database system where it goes immediately or real time into the system so that everybody that needs to see what's going on can eyeball it. The other reason why it's important, and these are just a few of the many reasons, is that when you need the technology to give the supervisors an opportunity to really observe how their subordinates are working. And so there may be occasions when you see an officer's kind of going off the rail. Well, if you catch him or her early enough, well, and instead of kicking them or terminating their service, you might be able to offer them some counseling. So for a variety of reasons, and Chuck and Seth will go into detail about this, I mean, technology is incredibly important. Now, there are two other areas that I'm going to talk about real quick. And these are areas that are not moving along as fast as we would like. They're making progress, but they have a very, very long way to go. One is staffing. Staffing is absolutely necessary for public safety, but it's also going to be critically important for this department to reform itself, because the anchor to the entire reform effort within the consent decree is the community policing plan. And Chuck will talk about this in a few minutes, but under the community policing plan, for it to work, you have to have enough police officers so that they can spend approximately 60% of their time addressing calls for service, but they've got to be able to spend about 40% of their time engaging with the community. And right now, this department is so short-staffed that it's not able to really address the public safety issue as strongly as it should, and it clearly is not in a position to address the community policing plan. So this is something that we as the monitoring, we keep our eye on this day in and day out. It's 24/7. They're making some progress, but the progress is slow. But this is an area that's going to have to be addressed, and the department's going to have to figure out a way to increase their staffing. The last area I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to turn this over to Chuck, is accountability. And what I'm referring to specifically is, how do you deal with police officers who engage in misconduct, and how do you make sure that they are appropriately and fairly disciplined, but in a way that if you have really, really bad police officers, you get them off the forces ASAP. This is an area that is really a challenge. Again, it's affected by the technology problems, it's affected by the staffing issues, and it's affected by the culture issues within this department. I mean, GTTF is just an example of some of the bad things that this department has probably been engaged in over decades. And so it's going to take a heavy lift to work through this situation. But I think, again, when we look at the leadership in the department, and we look at the leadership that Commissioner Harrison has put in place of the Public Integrity Bureau, I think that they are at least making some strides in the right direction. But it's really early in the game. It's really too early to assess, where they're going to end up at the end of the day. Right now, it is a serious challenge, and one that we keep a close eye on. So, Chuck, let me turn it over to you. You can put a little meat on the bones on some of the things that I've talked about, and then maybe we can take some questions.
Well, thank you, Ken, and you did an excellent job in kind of summarizing where the department is right now. They've made a lot of progress. That's the good news. I mean, they have made a lot of progress. And in light of COVID-19, which has had a huge impact on all of us, including the Baltimore Police Department, they've still continued to push forward. Training is one area where it had its largest impact because obviously having large groups of individuals sitting in class is not something that would be consistent with CDC guidelines. There is some in-person training going on, smaller class sizes, but they've really been leveraging remote training, creating different packages of training that can be done via distance learning, which is very good and has been very successful. So they, whereas it's had an impact, they've continued to be able to push forward. I can't say enough about the leadership team that Ken mentioned. He's really put together an all-star team. So it's going to take some time before you really start to see all the things that have been done. But certainly the pieces of the puzzle are in place. And I'm very confident that Baltimore will make a lot of progress in a relatively short period of time. Community policing has been put on hold for a couple of reasons. One, primarily to staffing. As Ken mentioned, staffing is critical. You have to be able to free up officer time. And right now, they are stretched thin, answering 911 calls and so forth. They've had demonstrations they've had to deal with. So they've had a lot of things. Now, the community policing plan was approved earlier this year, but next year will be when we're able to legitimately start to kind of focus on some of the aspects such as training and so forth to try to begin the process of implementing community policing. So that's behind schedule. But again, it's something that's in the works and will continue to be in the works. I don't know if there's any areas that Seth, you want to touch that maybe I missed or that Ken missed?
Well, why don't we do this? Since we've been talking for about 15 minutes or so, why don't we open it up for questions and comments for the time
All right.
being? And then I can slide in my my comments about some of the challenges that continue to dog BPD, as well as where BPD is headed over the course of the next 6 months to a year. So Jess and Ray and Darnell, do we want to open it up for questions?
Okay.
To our participants on Zoom, you may message me your questions and we will read them aloud for you. And you can continue to communicate with me should you need to. To our participants on Facebook, please feel free to write your questions in the comment section and we will also read them aloud. Darnell, I'll do the chat if you'll do Facebook.
Sure.
And we already have a question from Caitlin Goldblatt. Caitlin, if you could, based on the security of our Zoom, I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't mind going ahead and typing your question to me at this time. Darnell,
yeah.
Oh, here it is. Caitlin said, "Hi, thank you for hosting this meeting. My name is Caitlin Goldblatt, and I helped found Scan the Police back in June this year. 2 weeks ago, the Baltimore City Police Department deployed dozens of police officers, foxtrot and arrest wagons to a group of Black children hanging out down in the Inner Harbor, immediately citing the group hanging out as a civil disturbance. A girl was arrested, taken to juvenile booking, and cops discussed cutting her handcuffs off. This occurred while several shootings occurred throughout the city. This was a repeat of police activity that occurred in the same location at about a year and a half ago. Additionally, officers have engaged in thousands of car stops without coding the reasons why those car stops occurred and regularly call in stop and frisks as investigation stops, both being reasons cited as a need of the consent decree and the DOJ report. Cops are, in fact, told to perform car stops if they aren't on active calls. And I hear cops running car tags for investigation purposes every day. Aside from the GTTF, officers like Brian Rice, who instigated the arrest of Freddie Gray and who is still employed despite being a repeat domestic abuser, is still employed by the department, for example. The police also seem to be pushing for full radio encryption despite already having cell phones and an encrypted channel. In what way does this reflect Commissioner Harrison changing BPD culture for the better, making it more transparent, And in what way is this the appropriate application of police resources?
Let me start. There's a lot that needs to be unpacked there. Obviously, if the police are stopping people unconstitutionally, we obviously want to know that. I mean, as we do our assessment, I'm talking about the monitoring team over the next few years, these are the kinds of events that we need to know about. So if you have a complaint, and it sounds as though you do, I would suggest strongly that you file your complaint with the Public Integrity Bureau so that we as the monitoring team can get a look at it. And this is part of what we do. We will look at events like this, and this goes into the assessment as we determine down the road at some point whether or not the department is in compliance. And so I would ask you to take the time, because these are very, very important events you're describing. We need to know about them, and we need to look at the data so that we can take the appropriate steps to assess the department. So Seth, you or Chuck may want to add something to that.
Well, I'm trying to, there were about 5 or 6 different issues that Stacy raised there. And so I'll deal with the first one, which is the allegation that a number of youth were approached, stopped, and one was arrested down at the Inner Harbor. Oh, Caitlin is her name. I'm sorry, not Stacy. I apologize, Caitlin. You know, there is a BPD policy that officers are currently being trained on, having to do with low-level offenses, and about BPD using their discretion to take what's called the most effective, least intrusive response. And, you know, there is an open question that you've raised that even if there was a technical violation of the law, a misdemeanor being committed by anybody, whether arresting anybody was actually the right way to go about it. And if the youth were peacefully gathered there, there's a question about whether they were engaged in lawful First Amendment activity. That is something that BPD has been stressing. And in fact, they put out their first annual audit of First Amendment protected activity responses earlier this year. And right now we're considering their methodology for First Amendment protected activity in year 2. So anyway, these are things that, as Ken said, you know, the consent decree directly speaks to, that BPD's new and revised policies directly speak to. And if there's an arguable violation of any of those policies, it's something, as Ken said, that you should bring to our attention with whatever evidence you've got, and more importantly, bring to the attention of the Public Integrity Bureau so they can do what they're supposed to do, which is to make sure that officers, if they step out of line, are held accountable. So I think that was the first issue you raised, Caitlin, is whether there was something untoward or improper or in violation of policy or the Constitution with respect to how officers approached youth at the Inner Harbor the other week. Jess, maybe you can sort of tick through some of the other things that Caitlin raised, because I'm not sure that I was able to catalog all of them in my brain when you were reading them off.
The other was about transparency. It really talked about first investigative stops being reason cited as a need for consent decree. So it was what she feels are unlawful stop and frisks. There was
Right.
also speaking into the concern about the request for the department to have more encrypted channels for pushing for full radio encryption, despite already having cell phones and an encrypted channel.
Right.
She's concerned ultimately, in what way does this reflect Commissioner Harrison changing BPD culture for the better, making it
Right.
more transparent?
So I'll take the last issue, which has to do with encryption. You know, that is not something that the consent decree directly speaks to. You are correct that the consent decree does directly speak to increasing the transparency of BPD operations consistent with public safety. And that is something that we know that Commissioner Harrison is committed to. And to the extent that, again, you and any other member of the public believe that there are anti-transparency measures under consideration by the department, you ought to make your concerns known. You've made them known to us here, but you ought to make them known to to BPD. Again, that's not something radio communications that the consent decree directly speaks to, even though one of its broader and overarching goals is increased transparency. The second issue has to do with investigatory stops. I think you said that they've recategorized stop and frisks as investigatory stops. I mean, as a matter of law, that's what they are. Stops or stop and frisks are investigatory stops coupled with weapons pat downs. It is one of the most important areas of the consent decree. It is what officers are being trained on right now in the academy. They're undergoing consent decree mandated training on stop, searches, and arrests, and investigatory stops, or what are called Terry stops, are front and center there. And BPD's revised policies on Terry stops are front and center there. That training began back in February. It was interrupted for 4 months because of COVID, but they're probably about 80% of the way through the department now, with a projected end date of early December, before they cycle through the entire department. But look, that is something that we are going to be paying very close attention to, and that BPD's own auditors are going to be paying very close attention to. One of the problems, and Ken alluded to this earlier, is that BPD operates on incredibly antiquated technology now. And as we've reported a number of times in just about every report that we've published, if not every report, and we've published 5 so far. We've published 4 quarterly reports, and then the comprehensive reassessment that Ray mentioned at the outset. We've talked about how BPD's technological deficiencies makes it almost impossible right now to assess in a meaningful way whether Terry stops or investigative stops, particularly pedestrian stops, are being done in a constitutional way. That has been a problem that has dogged BPD for years. Right now, BPD is in the process of developing and implementing a brand new record management system, which will facilitate what's called electronic field-based reporting. And as Ken said earlier, what that means is that officers will be required to and will be entering information about investigative stops in real time into BPD's system so that the data can be easily accessed, assessed, aggregated, sliced and diced as needed to determine whether there are problematic patterns in investigative stops or whether individual investigative stops are problematic. Problematic to the point that they require a referral to internal affairs, not as problematic, but still in violation of policy such that they require immediate corrective action by supervising officers, or appropriate, and appropriate in a way that perhaps might earn an officer commendation down the road because of his following law and policy or her following law and policy. But the long story short, Caitlin, is that stops, searches and arrests, and in particular investigative stops, are something that we are particularly attuned to. We fully recognize that BPD's historical unconstitutional practice of conducting investigative stops is one of the reasons they're under consent decree. And so it's something that we're looking at closely now, and we're eagerly awaiting the finalization and implementation of the record management system so that we can do what we've not been able to do yet, and which BPD and DOJ know that we've not been able to do, and that is to meaningfully assess the constitutionality of BPD's investigative stops practices.
And now, do you want to go to Facebook?
Thank you, Seth. Yeah, I have one question on Facebook. It's from Natasha Bach Singleton. I think she's attended one of our forums before. Welcome back. She asks, how have the training facilitators been re-educated? Improved training facilities only work well with effective trainers.
I guess as the one among us who spent the most time at the training academy, I can speak directly to that. Ken gave a nice overview about how the instructors have been retrained. So over the course of the past year and a half, the academy, or the education and training section at BPD, has fully embraced what's called adult-oriented learning principles. And as Ken says, what that means is that training, which used to be an instructor sitting up at the front of the classroom and delivering a lecture, maybe with a PowerPoint at her back, now is more of a facilitator, right? And so rather than having, your prototypical high school classroom where you've got a teacher in front and 30 students, facing the teacher, you've got 6 tables around the classroom with 6 officers at each table. And you've got an instructor at the front. You're playing a video of some real world police event that the students, the officers, are then required to discuss among themselves about what they saw that was within BPD policy, what they saw that was without BPD, outside of BPD policy, and then to share that with the class, and then to have the facilitator, the instructor, guide the discussion. In addition, outside the classroom, for instance, in the use of force training that was done last year, you have officers confronted with real world, or, I guess, hypothesized real world situations in a gym where they're confronted with somebody who is being either actively aggressive or passively aggressive, and they have to respond in real time with the appropriate response that's within policy. And then the other officers are there together with the instructors to critique the officers that do the role plays. And every officer's got to go through the role play in the gym, right? By the same token, they do similar scenario, like hands-on scenario-based training regarding stop, searches, and arrests. They're doing that now as well. And so the instructors in the academy have essentially been retrained from doing lecture and PowerPoint presentations to doing this type of facilitated adult-oriented learning using scenarios. They have been trained within the academy to do that, and many of them, including the sergeants and lieutenants in the academy, have gone out to the Los Angeles Police Department over the course of the last year for 2 or 3 days of intensive training at the LAPD, which is really, the forerunner of this adult-oriented learning for police agencies. And so BPD has invested the resources in sending their instructors out to LAPD to get trained on doing facilitative adult-oriented learning, then bringing them back and introducing those new skills to the instructors at the academy. Another really important thing that shouldn't be overlooked on training and what's happening in the academy is that at long last, not only has BPD upgraded its facilities, it's increased the number of staff devoted to training. When the monitoring team first started, there were literally 3 police instructors that were devoted to in-service training. That means training of experienced officers. There were more officers devoted to training of incoming recruits, but there were only 3 officers devoted to the type of training that the consent decree really requires for experienced officers. Now, well, I should say at the very beginning of the use of force training that was started in May of 2010, they added 10 new instructors, police instructors, as well as 2 new law instructors to the staff, right? Those new police instructors and those law instructors have stayed on throughout, and now they are part of the stop, searches, and arrest training. Obviously, there have been officers who have cycled in and out of the academy to a degree, though the core group of instructors remains the same. In addition, because stop, searches, and arrest training is so law heavy, so constitution heavy, they've hired several new additional law instructors to help deliver the stop, searches, and arrest training content. And as I said, that training is underway. Finally, they have hired new civilian curriculum writers, individuals who are skilled at writing curriculum and are knowledgeable in writing police training curriculum in particular. Those civilians were onboarded earlier this year and now are helping to generate some of the new curricula that is in development and is being shared now with the monitoring team for our assessment and our technical assistance. So those are the types of things that are happening within the training academy that have led us to conclude that that is one of the truly bright spots in the reform efforts so far.
Thank you, Seth. I don't have any more questions now for Facebook.
So I just want to then take this break to circle back around and try to make sure we cover the whole agenda. So Ken, when you were talking about areas that continue to pose a serious challenge, you touched on community policing pretty firmly with the delays through the pandemic. But as far as the accountability piece and misconduct investigations and discipline supervision, Did we really touch on that?
I'm going to let Chuck go into some detail on that, but let me say this, and this goes back to one of the earlier questions, at least indirectly. What we are trying to do as the monitoring team and through the consent decree is to rebuild the accountability systems within the police department. And what I mean by that is this: we recognize that, and this is not only my view, but I believe this is the view of the monitoring team as a whole. Our view is that we can make progress in all of the other areas that are set up in the consent decree. And these are some very, very important areas. Seth has talked about them, and we'll talk about some more tonight. But in our view, unless and until the department can show and at least establish with some level of respectability that the department has gotten to a point where the community can have some level of trust in it, it really doesn't matter how well we do in the other areas. And so it seems to me, and I think to my team, that this whole area of misconduct and discipline, how you deal with police officers who have engaged in misconduct, is so important to the overall success of the consent decree. And so it's not only the largest section in the consent decree, but I mean, in terms of the effort that we are spending and will continue to spend in terms of trying to help this department develop itself, I think is an indication of just how important it is. So what are some of the problems? And then Chuck, I'll let you elaborate. But you don't have, when staffing, I mentioned staffing and technology. Well, those two areas are incredibly important to the success of the Public Integrity Bureau. And why do I say that? Well, you know, when you have, you've got close to 2,000, police officers in some respect. And at the end of the day, you have to recognize you're going to have bad apples. That's just the nature of the beast when you have that many people working. And so you have to have a system in place that will fairly address these issues. You don't want any police officer unfairly charged or unfairly treated, but you want them to have a fair hearing. They're entitled to due process. But when it is established with the requisite degree of proof that an officer has committed a policy violation, or in some cases, even a crime, these folks have to be dealt with. And some of these officers need to be removed from the force. So when you don't have sufficient investigators, which is a staffing issue, it takes a long, long time sometimes to get to that problem. Technology is a problem because until you can begin to develop the evidence, the data, and the patterns and practices that these officers, maybe some of these bad officers are involved in, it makes it much more difficult to remove the bad apples from this department. So what we're looking to do is to help this department, along with the Department of Justice, to develop a system so that it's fair, but at the same time that it requires officers who have broken the rules to be appropriately disciplined. So Chuck, you were a former chief. You can certainly speak to this far better than I can. So I'll open the floor to you.
Actually, you covered it very well. I think as far as misconduct investigations, from the time a complaint is received to the time it is investigated, I mean, one, the timeliness of it matters. And that's an area that we are focused on to see how long does it take for an investigation from start to finish. It has to be thorough, it has to be complete. And there are issues that come up. For an example, if it's misconduct that could result in criminal charges and is sent to the district attorney's office for review, that investigation is suspended until there's a decision made by the district attorney as to whether or not they're going to move forward with any kind of charges. But the majority of cases really aren't cases that rise to that level. So it's very important that, one, they be received, they be investigated thoroughly in a timely fashion. But also, if it's a sustained allegation, what's the appropriate level of discipline to make sure that the punishment fits the offense, if you will. And if there's an alternative to actual punishment, for an example, maybe it's a training issue, I think it's very important that there be follow-up to make sure that that additional training actually took place. If it's counseling, did it actually take place? what is the outcome? It just to make sure that it actually took place. That is something that has to happen. The person that makes the complaint needs to be informed along the way as to what it is that is taking place, the status of the investigation, what the outcome was, and so forth. That's a very important piece of any misconduct investigation that takes place. Seth, I know you spent some time in this area. I don't know if you want to jump in or not, but
Let me just reinforce what you said, Chuck, about the importance of timely, thorough investigations. The monitoring team did a comprehensive compliance review of misconduct investigations conducted by internal misconduct investigations conducted by BPD in 2018. It was the very first compliance review that we conducted. We completed it earlier this year. Our full report is an appendix to the comprehensive report that we published on September 30th. That report runs about 50 pages in length and details all of the various problems that we saw. So to Chuck's point, what we saw in 2018, and again, you should know that this is sort of before the reforms of the Public Integrity Bureau began in earnest. But at that point in time, it was clear that the investigations were not of the quality they need to be. It was clear that the files were largely in disarray. It was clear that investigations were taking too long. And it was clear that some of the analysis of the facts that were found, I shouldn't say this, I should say some of the investigations were not sufficiently thorough. All the evidence relevant to the investigation wasn't being run down. And so really from top to bottom, what that review told us is that at least as of 2018, and this did not come as a surprise to us, but that this was a unit, the Internal Affairs Unit, now called the Public Integrity Bureau, that was in need of a major overhaul. And all you need to do is sort of read the front pages of the newspaper to know why. I mean, again, you read about the Gun Trace Task Force scandal. You read periodically about officers who are alleged to have used excessive force or falsified reports, or most recently are accused of, trying to extort somebody who did a home repair, tried to put in a deck for them, who supposedly overcharged them for doing shoddy work. These types of things, although they're individual officers, show that it's a department that continues to have a culture problem. The culture is improving, as Ken said at the outset, but they still have a way to go. And reforming the Public Integrity Bureau is a way to do it. And look, I mean, we're talking about simple things here to begin to turn the Public Integrity Bureau around. Having, for instance, an investigative checklist so that every internal affairs investigation, is done the same way. Having a uniform record keeping system so that every internal affairs file has the exact same records, and you know exactly where to look to determine if a particular investigative step was taken or not. These are things that we didn't find in our compliance review that are now getting better, we can say anecdotally, in our periodic reviews of more recent files, and that we hope to see dramatic improvements around when we do our next review. But look, the way that the Public Integrity Bureau has been run historically has not been the way a Public Integrity Bureau should run in a well-functioning police department. And let me say this, it's not only that officers aren't always being held accountable for engaging in misconduct. The Public Integrity Bureau, because of its inefficiency, also sometimes doesn't treat officers the right way. There has to be procedural justice within the department as well. And because they're understaffed and because the investigations take so long, you have officers who are basically hung out in limbo, sometimes for upwards of a year, because they've got an internal affairs complaint that may well not be meritorious hanging over their head. That's not right for the officers either, and it hamstrings the way the department is run. That is something that Commissioner Harrison has tried to tackle, when he first came to the department. Adopted a policy which met with our approval, the monitoring team's approval and with the Department of Justice's approval, where he's trying to have minor allegations of misconduct addressed through negotiated resolution, rather than going all the way through the investigative process, so that the officer is appropriately disciplined, accepts responsibility, and so that caseloads and backlogs are reduced. This, at least hopefully, will redound to the benefit of all involved, to the citizens of Baltimore who want swift justice from BPD's internal affairs function, and to the officers themselves, who deserve a fair shake in the internal affairs process and who deserve to have their complaints resolved complaints against them resolved in an expedient manner. So anyway, that's one thing. Chuck, there is one thing that Ray's initial question, which I know was 10 minutes ago, prompted. And, we talk about this a lot in the report that we just published. It's really about accountability writ large, right? And misconduct investigations and discipline is one aspect of police accountability, a critical aspect of it. But another aspect, probably an even more important aspect, is supervision. And if you don't have sergeants and lieutenants, the first line supervisors, buying into the reform effort will fail. That's why the consent decree focuses a lot of its attention on supervisory reform and improvement. And I'm going to turn it over to Chuck, who's been dealing with that issue quite a bit in his work with the department.
Yeah, we've been working on a supervisor's manual, field supervisor's manual, that really lays out the roles and responsibilities, particularly with first line supervisors, which are sergeants and also lieutenants. That's where the rubber meets the road, and to make sure that they fully understand what their responsibilities are and that they're being held accountable for making sure that the personnel under their supervision are doing the job the way they ought to be doing it. One of the things you learn early on when you get promoted is that you're not only, because when you first come on the job and you're working, you're pretty much responsible for your own actions. But when you become a supervisor, you're responsible for the work and the behavior of those that are working under you. And you have to take that role very seriously. So they have to be held accountable to make sure that they're holding their officers accountable as well. So that manual is in a draft form now. There's still being some comments being made before it goes out for larger comment, but it's pretty thorough and it's pretty lengthy. But that is something that we've been working on, because without that, reform efforts, as Seth said, will not work. People have to be held accountable, and it starts with that first line supervisor. At least that's been my experience, the sergeants being the most important group of individuals to really make sure that things are being implemented properly out there in the field.
And
So
Chuck,
let me-
I'm sorry. I was going to ask Chuck real quickly to speak to the importance of unity of command, because that is something that has historically been absent within the BPD. And it's one of the reasons, that there has been a lax culture of oversight there. But Chuck, if you could speak to unity of command, what's been the problem with unity of command historically at BPD, and what BPD's trying to do now to shore up unity of command?
Well, I mean, I guess historically, part of the problem has been not everybody being on the same page as you go through the rank. One of the problems in policing is not just a Baltimore problem, but it's getting, policies and so forth are created at the very top of the organization. But the place where it's going to be actually have to be implemented is at the bottom of the organization. And there are all kinds of layers in between. And making sure that everyone is on the same page and we're holding one another accountable. So, as I mentioned before, sergeants are holding their officers accountable, lieutenants, the sergeants, captains, the lieutenants and the sergeants. And that has to happen at every single level. So this manual we're working on right now really focuses on sergeants and lieutenants, but we need to spend some time also looking at the other ranks too, to make sure that the role and responsibilities of those ranks are very clear as well, and that people are in sync with the police commissioner, with current policies, procedures, the training that's taking place, all that sort of thing. All those pieces have to come together, and everyone has a responsibility in that regard.
So let me add something to this, because both Seth and Chuck discussed or brought up the idea of the culture in the department. And this goes back to one of the earlier things that both Chuck and I and Seth talked about when we talked a little bit about leadership. And what we're seeing in this department, for example, I'm going to talk about a program called EPIC, which is Ethical Policing is Courageous. This is a program that Commissioner Harrison bought with him from New Orleans. Now, the purpose of this, it's a peer intervention program, and all that means is that officers are being trained to step in when they see a fellow officer, even if it's a supervisor. If he or she sees an officer crossing the line, that officer has the right to go up to that officer and say, look, Captain or Lieutenant or Sergeant, why don't you step aside for a second? Let me handle this. I think you might be this may be a little person for you, or whatever excuse you want to use. But the idea, quite frankly, is this is really I won't use the word selfish in a mean way, but it's designed to help save a police officer's career. Because as opposed to being in a situation and everybody's human, and some days, some people just have bad days, but you're having a bad day and you begin to engage in excessive force, this is where your fellow officer should step in, can step in, and can stop you from doing something that you will regret, because you'll either be fined, demoted, or fired, and in some cases you might go to jail. So the idea is to bring into this department different programs so that you can begin to change the culture in this department. So it starts at the top, and it works its way down. But I do think that is another example of some of the progress is not directly related to misconduct and discipline, but it's certainly part of the culture change that we're beginning to see in this department. And that EPIC training is ongoing now.
Right. What Ken is referring to is the duty to intervene, where it's policy, where if you see some misconduct or something happening on the part of another officer, you have an obligation and a duty to stop it. And if you don't, then of course you're being held accountable as well. Just one last thing on unity of command. One of the issues that affects that historically has been in staffing. We talked about staffing earlier. You need to be able to work with the same group of people as much as humanly possible. They need to have a particular person that they would report to. That's difficult when you're short-staffed, because you look up, you got a different sergeant all the time, or a different lieutenant, or somebody else is different in the chain of command. And that just complicates things even further. And so making sure you have the appropriate span of control so that a sergeant isn't overwhelmed. If they have 8 to 10 officers, they can handle that. If they go to work and they got all 20, that's very difficult to really pay attention and make sure everyone is doing what they need to be doing. So all those factors kind of come together when it comes to accountability and making sure that people are holding their subordinates, but holding one another accountable.
Okay.
Jessica, any other questions?
Better defer to Ray. We do have more, but we'll let Ray.
No, that's a lot to unpack. I think we need to kind of step back a little bit and see if the community has questions about all that information they got from all three of the panelists.
Darnell, I believe that on Facebook you have stuff that's in direct response to misconduct. I'll pause on my question for a moment.
Yep, I actually do. Another question from Natasha. She said that we continue to hear citizens are not able to file complaints about misconduct. Citizens are being told complaints aren't accepted at districts. Command staff at some districts have been removing misconduct complaints from the system. Investigators from internal affairs often miss appointments for citizens and then close cases with a comment that, quote, no evidence of misconduct was found, unquote. And most egregiously, in several cases, citizens have been confronted by officers and command staff and told to stop the complaint. Has there been any effort to improve the tracking of internal investigations since 2018? The second part to our question is a comparison of civilian review board investigation outcomes contradict public integrity outcomes. Consistently, the CRB sustained charges and find sufficient evidence of misconduct, and in many cases, criminal acts, while PIB finds no evidence of misconduct. Is there any effort to add comparison of CRB and PIB outcomes to identify outliers and increase efficiency of PIB processes? And last but not least, most mid to large size police departments assign officers under internal review to administrative duties without public contact for the duration of the investigation. BPD appears to assign officers under review to high profile public contact roles, desk duty at local districts, community liaisons, FTO. Has the monitoring team considered making this suggestion to isolate officers under review from further public contact until the investigation is over? So I can repeat each question so you can, answer each question as we go along if you don't remember.
Hey, Seth, why don't you handle the assessment part, because that's certainly within your purview and you probably have a good feel for that.
I'm not sure. I remember the CRB internal affairs piece of it. I can speak very quickly to that. And I do know that there is increasing coordination and, if you will, kind of comparison of notes between internal affairs and CRB about, how their investigations are going. It remains to be seen how that relationship is going to play itself out. Historically, that relationship has been fraught. It has not been a particularly cooperative relationship. One of the things that Public Integrity Bureau has done, to move the ball forward is that it has developed, as part of its own intake, classification, and investigations manual, protocols for sharing information with CRB, and for CRB sharing information with it, to make sure that investigations are done in a timely way, and so that CRB has all the information that it is entitled to have under the law. So again, those protocols are now in place. The full manual was just approved in September. And so again, it remains to be seen how effectively those protocols are going to be implemented and whether you're going to see sort of more, agreement in outcomes between CRB investigations and PIB investigations, Public Integrity Bureau investigations. I do understand that historically there has been, at least some disagreement there between what the CRB finds in a particular case and what internal affairs finds on BPD's side, and that obviously is problematic. So we're aware of that issue. On the assessments issue, we did our initial assessment from 2018. We're going to do another comprehensive assessment in, I don't know about the coming months because we're focused on a couple of other things, but we'll certainly begin it within the next year to see whether there have been improvements. What you say, and I think the caller's name or the participant's name is Natasha, if I've got it right. Is that right, Darnell? Yeah, I mean, what Natasha says about about districts not taking complaints, about commanders discouraging and other officers discouraging complaints is really problematic. And if you have evidence of those things happening, we need to know about it, because that's one of the major problems that the Department of Justice found in its investigation of BPD, is that BPD, whether it's a district or internal affairs, was inhospitable to taking complaints. And that's one of the reasons that there were such breakdowns within the integrity process, within the accountability process. That has been fixed on paper, and it was fixed early on paper. And again, if you've got evidence that you'd like to share with us about the ineffectiveness of these changes on paper, we need to know it, and we encourage you to share it with us. We've not been made aware of that kind of widespread problem that you allude to, Natasha. that, BPD is sort of engaged in a pattern or practice of turning away potential complainants, and is engaged in a pattern or practice of discouraging complainants. But again, if you've got even anecdotal evidence of that, that's something that we want to hear. We obviously do know that BPD investigations, including in serious cases, are taking too long, and that is frustrating at least the prospect of justice for people who make complaints. We are well aware of the Court of Special Appeals' recent decision in September, which upheld the trial court's dismissal or throwing out of a dozen serious misconduct complaints because they weren't signed off on within the year's statute of limitations. That's obviously a problem. It's something that we've reported on, and it's something that we'll continue to pay close attention to. But it's something that the Public Integrity Bureau definitely has to get right. They need to finish their investigations comprehensively and on time.
So let me repeat something. I don't like repeating things too often, but this is one that's worth repeating, Seth, and that is people in the community are the ears and eyes, not only for the city of Baltimore, but you guys need to be the ears and eyes for the monitoring team. As Seth indicated, the Department of Justice and the monitoring team worked with the Baltimore Police Department for over a year, as I recall, working on intake and classification policies and protocols. And so, as Seth indicated, the policy and the protocols on paper are designed to address the very issue you raised when you suggested that people's complaints are not being taken or they're being discouraged from filing complaints. I mean, the policies and the protocols are designed to make certain that people can file complaints either anonymously or they can file them over the phone, they can file them by email. The process on paper is to make it as easy as possible. So what's important for us is for those of you in the community, when you have evidence that these policies are not being followed, we need to know so that we can look into it, because unless we know, we will assume that the policies are having the effect that they were designed to have. So again, I simply want to repeat to everyone on this phone call or on this Zoom call that we expect you in the community to keep us updated and to tell us of events that you are aware of. It doesn't matter whether it's third or fourth or fifth hearsay. We want the information, and let us do what we need to do to drill down on it. So that's something that I wanted to repeat, because I do think it affects more than just misconduct. This has to do with every aspect of the consent decree.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anybody touched on, has the monitoring team considered making this suggestion to isolate officers under review from further public contact until the investigation is over?
Chuck, with your
It
experience,
depends. Yeah,
as a
it depends
police
on the
chief, I think
seriousness of the
you should take
allegation.
that.
It depends on the seriousness of the allegation. If an officer is going to be pulled from the street, or as we call it, benched, during the time that the investigation is taking place. So that really depends on the nature of the allegation, the seriousness of it, and then that decision is made whether or not that person should be reassigned to desk duty or something off the street, some administrative task or whatever, but taken off the street. That happens.
Thank you. I'll let you go ahead, Jess.
Do you have a question,
Sure.
Jess?
We have another question from Sarah. Is police recruiting being made a priority? Will there be additional screening processes to ensure that new officers are fit for duty?
Chuck?
Recruiting is a priority. In fact, we have regular calls about recruitment and hiring. They've actually been doing fairly well in terms of recruiting. Part of the problem that they have, though, is, in one sense you're hiring, and the other sense you're losing people through attrition, and that's difficult. And departments across the country are having difficulty at this point in time in recruiting individuals into the ranks. It's very difficult to keep pace. That's the problem with staffing. Even under the best of circumstances, sometimes it can take you a couple of years to increase the number of officers even by, let's say, 100, if that's the goal. Because for everyone you hire, you have to, you're not only filling a vacancy, you're making up for attrition. People retire, people pass, people quit, people get fired. You have all these different things going on with people leaving the ranks. And so, but yes, recruiting is taking place. They've been pretty successful in terms of getting applicants that are being screened. You know, you do the best you can to screen and bring people on that, you know, are not going to be problematic down the line. I mean, so yeah, there is a lot of screening that goes on, a lot of testing, psychological exams and the like that take place prior to actual hire.
So we have no more questions in the chat. Darnell, if you have any more questions, please feel free. And for those watching on the chat, you can send a message to me, Jessica Drake, the host, and I'll be happy to read it out for you.
Okay, yes, I do have a couple more. Continuing on the CRB PIB question, would you recommend, it's from Natasha again, would you recommend cases be revisited using the new process and procedures in the recently released manual? And also, while fixed on paper, evidence continues to be submitted to the commission's office, the monitoring team, and CRB. Where else should evidence be submitted?
I mean, in terms of, you know, alleged misconduct, you know, the most important places to submit, you know, complaints or evidence in support of complaints is to, as Natasha said, the Public Integrity Bureau on the BPD side and Civilian Review Board, CRB, on the civilian oversight side. You know, we are not, meaning the monitoring team is not authorized under the consent decree to conduct our own investigations. We don't do that. You know, what we do is we review the integrity of the investigations that BPD conducts. For instance, whether, you know, the integrity of the investigations that PIB conducts. So the most important place for evidence to be deposited or allegations to be deposited are with BPD, specifically the Public Integrity Bureau. And if folks don't feel comfortable going to BPD, they can do that. They can submit their complaints and their evidence to the Civilian Review Board, which will ultimately share it with PIB so that PIB can investigate on its own as well. You know, the consent decree does not say a whole lot about civilian oversight. It does not say really much at all about the Civilian Review Board. It does require BPD to develop the protocols for information sharing that it is now developed and finalized with the Civilian Review Board. But it doesn't really have other provisions that speak to, you know, what the city ought to do with the Civilian Review Board, you know, how BPD and the Civilian Review Board, you know, sort of ought to make ends meet at the end. It doesn't really contain that stuff. So our authority is rather limited in that regard. Ken, you might be able to speak to that a little bit more than I can, or at least add to what I've said if there's anything to add. But I mean, that's really, it is what it is. I mean, that's what the parties agreed to, but the consent decree just does not say a lot about the civilian review function, for better or for worse. And BPD, although it hasn't fully complied with those provisions yet, you know, those provisions are pretty limited, and it has addressed the, I would say, the lion's share of those provisions by coming up with these protocols.
No, Seth, I don't have a lot to add. I think you did a pretty good job. Let me just say this, because Seth is absolutely right. We do not investigate any complaint because that's not what we're authorized to do under the consent decree. And we are, of course, we actually are agents. We work for the federal judge, so we have to stay within the rules. Having said that, you know, there are occasions when, you know, folks bring information to us. And one of the examples is what I think it was Natasha who raised it earlier in terms of the complaints about certain districts not providing the forms or discouraging, or certain officers discouraging the filing of a PIB complaint. There are occasions where if you feel that you're not getting the attention that you deserve by going to PIB or even CRB, you can certainly reach out to me and to Seth, to Chuck, and to Hassan Aiden, who's actually, he is the lead in this area. I mean, we will certainly discuss the issue with you. We don't do the investigations, but as I said to you before, when you bring things like this to our attention, we then know where to begin to look when we start doing our data checks. And so it's important that when you have information, I mean, there's certainly a procedure and a process to follow. And with misconduct, I mean, your first place should always be either PIB or CRB, but don't feel uncomfortable by, reaching out to me or any member of our team, because, we're here to do an appropriate assessment. And we understand that, there are times when, we have to entertain some conversations that are off the record, but at least it allows us to know where we need to focus. And so, we don't encourage wholesale reports being filed in our mailbox, but we certainly are available if someone has a real concern about how they've been treated by someone at BPD.
So let me check in right now because we have about 10 minutes left, and I know we want to kind of quickly highlight right now where the BPD is in their focus, as well as where the monitoring team is in their focus. So we got about 10 minutes left. When you guys kind of address where is BPD focusing their immediate priorities right now?
Seth, I think this was in your bailiwick, if I'm not mistaken.
Sure. I feel like I've been doing a lot of talking, so I'm going to try to keep this brief, Ray, because I think we've actually touched on a lot of this. But, over the course of the next 6 months to a year, the things that BPD is really going to focus on is, one, improvements in technology, and in particular, getting this records management system up and running. We've talked about this. There are other aspects of technology, that the IT system that they're also working on, including a workforce management system, which will hopefully make patrol staffing more efficient, a learning management system, which will more effectively track officer training and assign officer training. And it's at the very beginning now, but an early intervention system, which at the end of the day, after the record management system is functional and these other systems are functional, will be used by supervisors to try to intervene with officers who are sending up red flags before they actually get themselves in trouble. So that's, good, well-functioning modern police departments have well-functioning early intervention systems to allow supervisors to intervene with their officers to stop misconduct and to stop rule or policy violations before they start. BPD in recent years has not had really much of an early intervention system to speak of. The consent decree requires them to develop one, and they're in the early planning stages of one right now. So that's technology. We talked about training. They're finishing up stop searches and arrest training. They have just begun training on behavioral health awareness and responses to allegations of sexual assault. That is ongoing right now, department-wide. In the relatively near future, as Ken said, they're going to do this ethical policing is courageous, or active bystandership, peer intervention training, very important. Chuck alluded to this earlier, but there is a renewed and all important focus on community policing, recognizing that it is, goes hand in hand with constitutional policing as probably the two biggest goals of the consent decree. And so community policing training is going to be rolled out earlier next year, as well as training on the new First Amendment protected activities policies. And then there's some other mandated training that's going to be conducted as well, like training on deadly force, which will reinforce some of the use of force training that officers received last year. So training is another area of focus. BPD is nearing the end of the policy revision process. It has either issued new policies or revised new policies in probably 50 different areas so far. There are a few remaining. One, which Ray alluded to earlier, which is out for public comment. Will be out for public comment, is out for public comment now, has to do with youth interactions and reinforcing the idea that officers, where possible and where advisable, to be diverting youth from the criminal legal system and into support networks that avoid criminal outcomes. So there's one. There's another which I referred to earlier, which is stop, searches, and arrest policies around low level or what are called quality of life offenses like disorderly conduct, trespassing, loitering, littering, that type of stuff, and how BPD officers should be responding to those. They are working on policies involving discipline right now, there is, as we said, a brand new kind of state-of-the-art Public Integrity Bureau investigations manual that covers intake, classification, and investigations. Now they've got to work on the discipline part of it. And they've got to refine the disciplinary matrix and the disciplinary policy. So that's going to be a focus of the next 6 months. BPD also, last thing, is that they are ramping up their audit or self-assessment function. So just as for instance, they will be publishing within the next 3 months an analysis of their first quarterly analysis of all arrests that result in individuals being released without charges, because those are the arrests that, at least on their face, raise red flags about whether people are being arrested without probable cause or not. And so that first quarterly audit report will be issued, and then in subsequent quarters throughout the life of the consent decree and hopefully thereafter, reports on release without charge arrests will be issued. BPD is continuing to audit on a regular basis both the functioning of equipment in their transport vehicles, both patrol cars and transport vans, as well as whether BPD officers who are doing the transports are following BPD transport policies. You obviously know that transport is a critical area, given that one of the things that spawned the consent decree is what happened to Freddie Gray during the course of transport. And BPD is also going to be soon engaged in its second annual audit, self-audit of its responses to First Amendment protected activity, public protests and things like that. So all that self-assessment work, which is vital to the proper functioning of a modern police department, is underway. And Commissioner Harrison is committed to ramping up that function. As far as the monitoring teams work, we're going to continue to provide intensive technical assistance on training and on policies. We're going to continue to engage in observation and assessment of the training that goes on in the academy and of the self-assessments that I just mentioned. And we're going to be ramping up our compliance review and outcome assessment function as BPD's data becomes more readily accessible to us. So we're about to begin our first comprehensive review of use of force incidents and use of force reporting and supervisory review. That will cover years 2018 and 2019. We're also going to begin a little bit after that our first comprehensive review of BPD's responses, the timeliness and the effectiveness of their responses to calls for service. So those are the things that you can expect coming down the pike in the next 6 to 9 months.
Thanks, Seth. So you alluded
Hey,
to
Ray, before you do that, let me add one thing real quick, because we didn't spend a lot of time talking about BPD's interaction with folks with behavioral disorders, and I just want to repeat what I said early on. This is another one of those areas where community input is so important. For example, right now there's a committee called the Collaboration, Planning, and Implementation Committee, which is composed of a lot of different voices, but a lot of them are directly from the community. And this group has been instrumental in helping to develop a strategy to bridge the gap between the resources that police officers need when they want to divert someone away from the intake center and send them to a facility where they can get treatment. So it's a really it's a big deal. There's a lot going on. But the reason I'm raising it right now is because I'm trying to emphasize just how important it is that community members participate in this process, because you guys can really be helpful. So I'm sorry, Ray, you can Go ahead.
No, you said exactly what I was going to say. Just flashed up while Seth was talking earlier, a screenshot of our monitoring team feedback page, where we want to encourage people to give feedback and get engaged in this process however you can. All of the policies and the training curricula that are up for public comment are available on bpdmonitor.com, as well as the city's transparency site. Seth mentioned earlier the effort that the city is putting forth to create a mechanism to actually publicize and message around current policies, curricula, and other ways to engage with BPD. And they're starting that whole process off with this youth policy, where the goal is to ensure that if you have public concerns, if you have issues, that there is a comfortable mechanism for you to kind of relay that message. And in our role as the monitoring team, we kind of have the authority to oversee how BPD performs in those situations. And if you are specific and give us that case or incident information, we can follow that more closely and follow up more efficiently. So if you have issues with police, good or bad, or if you just have ideas on how you can make things better in your community, we beg you, please reach out to the monitoring team and give that feedback. Check the monitoring team's website for current policies that are up for public comment, as well as training curriculums, so you can be involved. And remember, on the 29th of this month is the quarterly public hearing with Judge Bradar. So I'm just to stay abreast, like the judge said following the Judge Floyd incident, is we have a blueprint, we have a map. I think at this point, it's going to take all of us to get involved so we can get it done. So I think we have a minute left. I want to thank everybody for coming out. I want to thank the monitoring team for giving an abundance of information and talking everyone's head off, but that was great. And if you have any questions, please reach out to info@bpdmonitor.com and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Night. Thank you.